but does not need reaction mass. So it's like a rocket engine, but without the exhaust plume. At its heart, there is a microwave cavity, a resonant microwave cavity, and the special shape of this cavity enables the momentum in the electromagnetic wave, which is propagating inside the cavity, to be transferred to the cavity itself, and therefore you are changing electrical energy into kinetic energy. Well, it all started way back in the depths of the Cold War, actually. There was considerable concern over the accuracy of the guidance systems of the strategic missiles that were being deployed at that time. And it was of such concern that a small group of R&D engineers was put together. I was part of this group. And we were actually told to think the unthinkable, to try and come up with solutions to this problem. And it was during that absolutely brilliant exercise that I actually got my early ideas for M-Drive. The solution wasn't M-Drive, and I went off and did some quite interesting things for the British Army after that. But in 1980, I was in the middle of the desert when the Iran-Iraq war broke out, and it was all very alarming. And so when I got back to the UK, I decided I'd better find a new career path. And I joined the space industry. And it was while I was working on the design of the Skynet 4 communication satellite that it dawned on me that what I'd been working on previously, some years before, would be ideal for propelling satellites, particularly military satellites in this case. So that was really where it all came from. Oh, the eternal question. No, M-Drive does not break Newton's laws. In fact, it works because of Newton's third law. M-Drive produces thrust in one direction, and if it's allowed to, it will accelerate in the opposite direction. Momentum is conserved by this process. And that's what Newton's third law is looking for. In fact, M-Drive is based purely on classic physics, the physics of Maxwell, Newton, and Einstein. There is really no need to bring in exotic physics to explain M-Drive. We don't need quantum vacuum plasma effects. And it is most certainly not a warp drive. No, it is not reactionless. It is propellantless, or propellant-free perhaps. But in real life, there's no such thing as a reactionless drive. You know, Newton doesn't allow for it, and I don't attempt to build one. Well, the main players are still in the UK, China, and the US. However, there are 3 other countries that have serious programs running that I know of. And there are also a growing number of university departments and private individuals who are trying to replicate our first experiments. This is of concern because an M-Drive is a potentially lethal device, particularly if you are close to measuring reasonable amounts of thrust. It means you have a very high Q cavity. You are putting in a significant amount of input power, and this makes it quite dangerous. So The way to handle the device is the way that I learned in my early career as a defence contractor. You must devise rigorous, strict and knowledgeable safety procedures before you start experimenting with M-Drive. It has the potential to kill you, and you must obviously bear this in mind. It's great fun, and it's very tempting just to rush in and test it, but you must consider the safety aspects before you do this. Second generation M-Drive, which is the superconducting version of M-Drive, will give us eventually low-cost access to space. Now this will make solar power satellites economical. They will in fact be far cheaper and considerably more safer than nuclear power stations, for instance. What at present is really not economically viable will become the obvious source of clean, green electrical energy. Now, the space planes that will be developed and used as launch vehicles for this low-cost access to space can also be used, can be developed into long-haul aircraft. They will give vertical takeoff and landing, so you don't need runways anymore. You'll get city center flights. They'll be quiet, green, and importantly, the airframes for these aircraft or space planes will be essentially low-stressed airframes. What we're proposing is that we use liquid hydrogen to actually cool the superconducting cavities, and then the hydrogen gas which boils off from this cooling process is used in fuel cells to provide the electrical energy into the M-Drive engine itself. So while you're going through the atmosphere, you're simply using liquid hydrogen fuel as fuel. Once you get out of the atmosphere, you'll need a small amount of liquid oxygen as well. But the end product of the process is simply water. So, okay, we'll get a few more vapor trails, but it's clean and green. Well, what we're proposing in our development program is that we start off with small-scale UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles, and these will be used to as part of the development process. But clearly, once we have these flying, the next step would be simply to scale them up to small personal air vehicles. So possibly one of the first wide-scale applications that we may see are the longed-for flying cars. So perhaps there is a solution to the city traffic jams. Well, I think there's been an interesting study done in Europe as to how you would actually incorporate a flying personal air vehicle into society, and the thinking is that it will almost certainly be an autopilot. You won't fly these yourself, and you won't own them. I'm sure you'll simply ring up for a vehicle to take you from A to B. It will arrive, land outside your home or office, and will automatically take you to wherever you want to go. This seems to be a rather more sensible way of incorporating these vehicles safely into the infrastructure, the traffic infrastructure. So I suspect, in the long term, the cars and other vehicles that we have today will become purely for leisure use and perhaps of historical interest only. Yes, we did. We have done a number of design studies, and one that I've reported on in previous conferences is the fairly large 300-ton spaceplane for delivering 50-ton payloads into geostationary orbit. Now, these spaceplanes operating on a regular basis will bring the costs per kilogram of payload to geostationary orbit down by a factor of 130 compared to the existing launch vehicles. Now, this is a huge cost saving. It's better than 10 times the cost saving that has been thought necessary to make solar power satellites viable, for instance. You will have then the ability to put large payloads, 50 tons a time, into orbit, and therefore, if you can put solar power satellites into orbit, you can also put solar sunshades into orbit. The other important thing to note is that these sunshades will be totally controllable, because first generation M-Drive, which will be used for in-orbit applications, will give you total control over the angle of these sun shields, and therefore you will be able to control them on basically a minute-by-minute basis to give you the exact amount of thermal control that you need. Well, this is a particularly interesting aspect of the type of vehicles that we're proposing will use M-Drive technology. Essentially, they are vehicles. They're called space planes. They operate both in the atmosphere and above the atmosphere in space. And the thing about them is that their flight envelope is such that they don't go fast inside the atmosphere, and they don't accelerate very fast. So the stresses, the thermal and mechanical stresses that we see in current aircraft will be very much reduced. Because in effect you only go fast when you're in vacuum, it makes it clearly a lot more efficient way of flying, but it also, as I say, means that the airframe can be built using a much more low technology. In fact, it's very suitable for the sort of technology that is currently used in the car industry. And therefore, we can envisage high volume production of these launch vehicles using low-cost technology. Some of it is already being developed by the automobile industry. I mean, the obvious example is hydrogen fuel cells. I mean, that's well into development now for cars, and will apply directly to space planes. So I don't believe that it's a cost factor that is going to hold up the development and application of M-Drive. Clearly, the existing infrastructure and the large industrial vested interests that produce this infrastructure are going to wish to slow down or even suppress such new technology. Now, this is not a new problem. Any disruptive technology has this problem. However, the world's problems are getting so serious that the politicians and the industrialists should start to take note of this. And I'm sure if they don't in the West, then we will find the developing countries that don't have this inbuilt set of vested interests will simply take over the technology, develop it using, as I say, fairly low-cost manufacturing techniques, and will simply solve the problem for us. So there's a challenge there. It's rather more a political challenge than a technical challenge, I would say. Okay, well, in 50 years' time, I believe that M-Drive will help us to dramatically reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. This in itself will help with climate control, or reducing the rise of temperature of our world. I also believe that the sun shields will come into play to finally counteract the climate change, temperature change. So I think we will have cracked those particular problems. I think we will have a much more user-friendly transport arrangement. Everybody wants to get rid of traffic jams, and it is a nonsense